So, let's talk about what happens when a crisis spirals out of control. In South Africa, a devastating disease, foot and mouth, was threatening the entire livestock industry. And when the official response just wasn't enough, the farmers themselves decided to step up. This is the story of how they took the fight into their own hands.
That's the voice of a farmer named Cobus. And his words, they really hit home. He says if you haven't lived through foot and mouth disease, or FMD, on your own farm, you just can't understand it. And he knows what he's talking about. It's hit his farm twice. This really gets to the core of it, right? For the people on the ground, this isn't some distant news story. It's a daily fight for their very survival. So this is really the inside story. It's about what happens when the system that's supposed to protect you, well, it just breaks down. The answer? The farmers stepped up, they got organized, and they started carving out their own path forward when nobody else would. Okay, so first up, a crisis out of control. Because, look, to really get why the farmer solution is so important, we first have to wrap our heads around the massive scale of the problem they were up against. And you don't have to take my word for it. The word coming directly from the front lines was just blunt. FMD was out of control. This wasn't just a few isolated cases. The whole situation was spiraling, and fast. So what exactly is foot and mouth disease? Well, it's this super contagious virus that hits livestock. Think cattle, sheep, pigs. And while it doesn't always kill the animal, it causes incredible suffering. But here's the real kicker for farmers. The moment it's detected, it triggers these immediate, absolutely devastating restrictions on trade. And when we say devastating, we mean it. Take Copus, the farmer we heard from earlier. A whopping 62% of his entire income comes from selling his animals. When his farm got hit with FMD, boom, he was banned from trading for a full 12 months. Just think about that. Imagine over half your paycheck just vanishing overnight for an entire year. That was the reality for him and so many others. All right, which brings us to our second section. The official response falls short. Because, of course, the government had to do something. But as this crisis got worse, this huge gap started to open up between the people making the plans and the people living the nightmare. And, the first step they took seemed pretty logical. They formed a task team full of experts. We're talking people with PhDs, deep knowledge of veterinary science, the works. The goal was to come up with a solid plan. But here's where things started to go wrong. That government task team, they had all the book smarts, all the academic knowledge you could ask for. What they didn't have was on-the-ground experience. They weren't the ones facing this thing day in, day out. And that was the crucial missing piece. And that disconnect had a huge, huge consequence. Because without that real-time feedback from the farms, the government basically had blinders on. They had no idea just how bad the spread really was. And how can you fight a fire if you don't know how big it is? It crippled their response right from the get-go. Okay, so that brings us to the turning point. Section 3, farmers take the lead. They were staring down the barrel of financial ruin, the official response wasn't working, and they realized they couldn't just sit around and wait for a solution to fall from the sky. They had to be the solution. So groups like the Stud Breeders Federation, they swung into action. They started putting pressure on officials. They forced open new lines of communication. And they basically said, hey, we're here, on the ground. Use us. Let us help you tackle this thing. And you know what? It worked. All that pressure paid off. The Minister of Agriculture actually gave them a formal mandate. An official FMD industry coordination group was created, made up of 10 people from the industry who would advise the minister's office directly. I mean, this was a game changer. For the first time, the farmers had a real seat at the table. So now we get to the heart of it. Section 4, a three-pronged battle plan. Okay, so they finally have this crucial seat at the table. What did they do with it? Well, they came up with this really smart, comprehensive three-part strategy to finally get ahead of the disease. And, just as importantly, get their businesses back up and running. First things first, and this was the most urgent piece of the puzzle, vaccines. They immediately started working the phones, trying to lock down millions of doses from international suppliers. And the number they were aiming for was huge, over 5 million doses by March. A number big enough to finally turn the tide and put them, as they said, ahead in this fight. And they weren't putting all their eggs in one basket. They sourced different types of vaccines from all over the world. There was a trivalent one, that means it fights 3 strains of the virus, coming from Turkey, and another one from Botswana. Then they also got a duvalent, a 2-strain vaccine, from a company called Biogenesis. The idea was to create this kind of multi-layered defense against the virus. And the timeline here was super aggressive. The first shipments were set to land in mid-February. Then the delivery from Botswana was expected at the end of that same month. And all of this was building up to that huge wave of 5 million more doses in March. You could just feel the momentum starting to build, right? Okay, but here's the thing. Vaccines are only one part of the equation, right? It solves the health crisis, sure. But what about the economic crisis? If you can't move or sell your animals, you're still going out of business. They needed a way to prove that their healthy animals were in fact safe to trade. And this leads us to the second part of their plan, which is, frankly, pretty ingenious. They called it an animal passport system. The idea is actually really simple, but so powerful. An animal gets vaccinated, an electronic record is created for it, and that record acts just like a passport for a person. It proves the animal's health status, clearing it for movement and for business. This would essentially unfreeze the market for all the farmers who were doing the right thing.
All right, so the final piece of this three-pronged plan was all about policy. The existing laws were, in their words, draconian. Basically, the penalties for reporting an FMD case were so harsh that farmers were actually terrified to come forward. And you can see the problem there, right? This fear created a massive blind spot for officials. They could never get a real handle on the problem because they weren't getting the data. So that had to change.
Okay, on to our final section, the future of farming. Look, this whole industry-led plan is a huge shift. It's monumental. But let's be clear, this fight is not over, not by a long shot. There are still some really big dangers on the road ahead. And the farmers, they're not naive about this. They're looking at these challenges with their eyes wide open. For instance, these imported vaccines, they haven't actually been tested against the specific local strains of the virus in South Africa. That's a big question mark. Then there's the threat of illegal, maybe even harmful, vaccines flooding the market. And on top of all that, there's a simple logistics problem. The state vets just don't have enough people to give out millions of shots. That's a huge hurdle. But even with all those obstacles, their core mindset hasn't changed. It's all about being proactive. And this quote from Kobes, I think it just perfectly sums up the spirit of this entire effort. Let's not complain about the problem. Let's make a plan to get to someone who can make a difference. It's not about whining, it's about doing. And that really leaves us with a big final question to think about. What we've just walked through is the story of an entire industry that refused to just be a victim. Instead, they grabbed the wheel and took control of their own future. So you have to wonder, could this be a new model for how we handle a crisis? A model where the people who are actually on the front lines are the ones empowered to lead the way?